Long before words like apocalypse or doomsday ever entered human language, there was already something quietly shaping the way civilizations built their world. It was not fear in the modern sense, not panic or hysteria, but a deeper instinct and awareness that the surface of reality was fragile, and that safety might one day require retreat rather than expansion. Archaeology usually teaches us to see the past as a story of progress. Villages become cities. Stone huts become temples. Walls grow higher, towers reach upward, monuments rise toward the sky, as if humanity has always believed that survival depended on visibility, dominance, and control of the landscape. But scattered through history are structures that move in the opposite direction. They descend instead of rise. They hide instead of proclaim. They seem less concerned with being seen than with enduring. These are not the places that greet visitors with grandeur. They are sealed, buried, carved into hillsides, or swallowed by the earth itself. And what makes them unsettling is not simply their age, but the suggestion that they were built with a future catastrophe in mind, a future their builders may have believed was inevitable. Historians tend to frame ancient construction around immediate needs: defense against invaders, religious devotion, storage of food, displays of power. Those explanations often work well enough until they don't. Until a structure appears that is overbuilt for its stated purpose. Too deep, too isolated, too carefully engineered, to survive conditions that no ordinary war or seasonal hardship would require. Some believe these places are coincidences, clever uses of terrain, or symbolic architecture, misunderstood by modern eyes. Others argue they reflect a worldview that no longer exists, a time when cycles of destruction were not abstract theories, but lived memories, passed down through myth, ritual, and story. Across cultures that never met, strikingly similar ideas appear: floods that erase civilizations, winters that last for generations, fires from the sky that turn cities to ash. Even when stripped of poetic language, these stories often describe environmental collapse with unnerving clarity: rivers boiling, crops failing, the sun dimming behind veils of smoke or dust. Survival, in these narratives, rarely comes from fighting the disaster. It comes from hiding from it. What is rarely discussed is how much effort it takes to build for that kind of future. To carve deep chambers into bedrock by hand. To plan ventilation systems without electricity. To design spaces where thousands could live underground for months, even years, without sunlight. These are not panic responses. They are long-term projects, requiring coordination, resources, and above all, confidence that the threat is real enough to justify the cost. That confidence may be the most disturbing element of all. Modern civilization prepares for disasters too, but often reluctantly, reactively. Emergency bunkers are built after wars begin. Shelters are stocked after sirens are installed. In contrast, many ancient underground or sealed structures show no signs of haste. Their walls are precise. Their layouts deliberate. Their construction suggests patience, not desperation. Some argue this reflects religious thinking rather than practical fear. That preparing for the end of the world was a symbolic act, a way of expressing faith in renewal, rebirth, or cosmic order. But symbolism alone struggles to explain the engineering choices, the thickness of walls, the isolation of sites, the redundancy of locations built miles apart, as if one failure was expected. There is also the question of what was being protected. In many of these places, there is little evidence of wealth. No hoards of gold, no royal tombs, no extravagant decoration. Instead, we find empty chambers, utilitarian spaces, storage rooms, ventilation shafts, places meant not to glorify the present, but to preserve life itself. Some believe these builders were responding to experiences already endured, that their myths were not speculative fantasies, but distorted memories of real events: volcanic winters, massive floods, impacts from space, or regional wars that escalated beyond control. Others caution against reading modern anxieties into ancient stone, reminding us that humans have always imagined endings. Yet even skeptics admit something feels unfinished in the official explanations. There is a difference between a fortress and a refuge. A fortress assumes an enemy that can be seen, confronted, defeated. A refuge assumes something else entirely: an enemy that cannot be fought, only waited out. This distinction matters, because many of the structures we are about to explore seem designed not for battle, but for endurance. They are quiet places. Cool, dark, acoustically strange. Places where sound behaves differently, where time seems to slow. Spaces that feel sealed, not just physically, but psychologically, as if meant to separate those inside from whatever chaos unfolds above. Some believe that is coincidence. Others notice that such spaces appear most often in regions rich with stories of cosmic cycles, ages that end in fire, water, or ice, only to begin again. In these traditions, survival is not heroic, it is humble. You do not stop the end. You hide from it, preserve what you can, and emerge when the world is ready again. If that worldview shaped ancient architecture, then these buried spaces are not anomalies. They are expressions of a philosophy. We no longer share a belief that collapse is not a failure of civilization, but an expected phase of existence. And if that is true, then the question changes. It is no longer simply why ancient people built such places. It becomes why we stopped thinking that way. Why we assume permanence where our ancestors expected cycles. Why we trust the surface so completely, when so many before us chose stone, darkness, and silence instead. Because once you accept that some of humanity's greatest efforts were devoted not to expansion, but to survival after collapse, the structures themselves begin to look less mysterious, and far more intentional. In the hills of Bihar, India, there is a place where stone behaves in ways it should not. At first glance, the site appears modest: low ridges, sparse vegetation, nothing that signals a technological anomaly. And yet, step inside the chambers of the Barabar caves, and the rules seem to change. The walls do not absorb light. They return it. Sound does not fade into rough surfaces, but rebounds cleanly, sharply, as if the stone itself were listening. The granite interiors are polished to a mirror-like sheen, so precise that reflections appear distorted only by the curvature of the rock, not by any imperfection in the surface. Even today, visitors often mistake the chambers for being lined with metal or glass, rather than solid stone carved more than 2,000 years ago. Archaeologists date the caves to the 3rd century BCE, during the reign of Emperor Ashoka. On paper, that places them firmly within a known historical framework. Iron tools existed. Skilled labor existed. Stone carving was not unusual. And yet, nothing else from that era or from any earlier period in India looks like this. The polish found inside these caves, often referred to as Mauryan polish, appears suddenly, fully developed, and then vanishes just as abruptly from the architectural record. There is no gradual evolution leading up to it. No earlier attempts. No later refinements. Just a brief moment in history, where stone was treated with a level of precision that would challenge modern machine tooling. Followed by silence. Some researchers argue the technique involved extensive hand polishing with abrasive materials over long periods of time. In theory, this is possible. In practice, the scale raises questions. These are not small decorative surfaces. Entire chambers' walls, ceilings, curved interiors were brought to an even, reflective finish. The labor required would have been immense. More troubling is the consistency. Hand polishing tends to leave subtle irregularities. Here, scans show flatness and symmetry approaching industrial tolerances. In 2022, modern surface analysis confirmed what many had suspected. The flatness of certain walls rivals that produced by contemporary mechanical processes. This does not mean ancient builders possessed machines, but it does mean they achieved results that modern engineers would struggle to replicate by hand alone. Even with today's knowledge, official explanations stop there. They describe the caves as religious retreats, donated by Ashoka to the Ajivika sect, an ascetic group that believed the universe operated according to absolute fate. According to inscriptions, these men rejected ritual sacrifice, denied free will, and lived austere lives removed from society. In that sense, caves carved into rock make symbolic sense. But symbolism does not explain the polish, nor does it explain why the name Ajivika was later chiseled out of some inscriptions, as if someone attempted to erase the group from memory. Their texts have not survived. Their beliefs are known only through hostile accounts written by rivals. They appear in history briefly, then disappear. One cave in particular deepens the unease. Lomas Rishi, often considered the most visually striking, lacks Ashokan inscriptions entirely. Its exterior features a carved arch with elephants approaching what appear to be stupa symbols, suggesting ceremonial importance. Yet inside, the chamber is unfinished. The walls are rough. The polish is absent. The interior feels abandoned mid-construction, frozen in an earlier stage of development. The layout itself is peculiar. A rectangular hole leads to a circular chamber at the rear, a shape that feels less like a shrine and more like a sealed vault. The dimensions are precise. The acoustics are intense. Stand in the center, and even a whisper seems to press back against you. Some believe this cave represents a failed experiment. Others argue it was intentionally left unfinished. a prototype abandoned once its purpose was fulfilled elsewhere. Either way, it introduces the idea that these caves were not simply carved as devotional spaces, but as part of a process, something tested, perfected, and then discontinued. Context matters here. India's ancient literature is filled with descriptions that blur the line between myth and catastrophe. The Mahabharata, in particular, speaks of weapons that burned brighter than 1,000 suns, of cities turned to ash, of survivors whose hair and nails fell out. These passages are often interpreted metaphorically, but their imagery has drawn comparisons to modern accounts of radiation exposure. No evidence has ever been found that nuclear weapons existed in antiquity. Most scholars reject the idea outright. But the question raised by some theorists is not whether such weapons existed, but whether ancient people believed they might face destruction on that scale, whether through divine judgment, cosmic cycles, or technologies lost to time. Viewed through that lens, the Barabar caves take on a different character. Their thick granite walls, their stable internal temperatures, their ability to repel moisture, their isolation from population centers. These are features one would expect in a shelter designed to endure extreme conditions. Inside the caves, the temperature remains cool, even during brutal Indian summers. The polished surfaces cause water to bead and roll away rather than seep into the rock. The acoustics amplify sound in ways that could be disorienting, or perhaps useful, depending on intent. Everything feels controlled, contained. Critics point out that there is no direct evidence the caves were ever used as shelters. No signs of habitation. No food storage remains. No human debris. But absence cuts both ways. A refuge meant for rare, catastrophic use would not show signs of daily life. It would wait, sealed and silent, for a moment that might never come. Perhaps that moment never did. Most archaeologists settle on a safer conclusion. They describe the caves as a technological anomaly and extraordinary achievement, with no known predecessors or successors. A brief flowering of skill under imperial patronage, later abandoned as styles and priorities changed. And yet, that explanation feels incomplete. Technologies rarely disappear entirely without leaving traces. Skills are passed on, adapted, simplified. Here, the polish vanishes almost overnight, as if it were not lost, but deliberately abandoned. Some writers suggest Ashoka himself suppressed certain forms of knowledge after embracing non-violence. Others link the disappearance of the Ajivicus and the polishing technique to a broader effort to erase ideas considered dangerous or heretical. None of this can be proven. But the pattern remains. Sudden emergence, sudden disappearance, and a structure that still feels out of place in its own time. Whether the Barabar caves were sanctuaries against imagined apocalypse or monuments to a philosophy of fate, they leave behind the same unsettling impression. They feel less like expressions of faith, and more like instructions carefully carved, precisely executed, and then sealed away. As if their builders believed that someone, someday, might need them. What unsettles historians most about the Barabar caves is not their existence, but their isolation in time. They do not belong to a visible lineage. There is no clear before, and no convincing after. Instead, they sit in history like a finished answer to a question that was never written down. In most technological traditions, progress leaves fingerprints. Techniques improve gradually. Mistakes accumulate. Early versions look crude, later ones refined. Even lost technologies tend to survive in fragment simpler copies, degraded imitations, or written descriptions that hint at what once existed. The polishing technique seen in Barabar offers none of this. It arrives fully formed, achieves a level of precision that feels excessive for its era, and then disappears as if it had never been intended to persist. This suddenness has led some researchers to describe the caves not as the peak of a tradition, but as a technological event, something that happened briefly, under very specific conditions, and then stopped. The polish itself is the key. Known today as Mauryan polish, it creates surfaces so smooth they behave optically, reflecting light evenly across curved stone. This is not decorative shine. It is functional smoothness, extending across entire chambers rather than limited to symbolic elements. The effort required to achieve this on granite or rock, notoriously resistant to abrasion would have demanded extraordinary coordination and time. If such effort was invested, why was it never repeated? One possibility is that the technique was tightly controlled, perhaps limited to imperial patronage under Ashoka. But empires rarely abandon effective methods simply because a ruler changes priorities. Builders trained in such skills would carry them elsewhere. We would expect to see echoes of the technique spreading, diluted perhaps, but recognizable. Instead, the architectural record goes silent. Another possibility is more uncomfortable, that the technique depended on knowledge, materials, or methods that were deliberately suppressed or lost very quickly. Not forgotten over centuries, but removed. This idea gains traction when placed alongside the fate of the Ajavikas. They were not a minor sect. At their height, they were influential enough to receive imperial support. Yet within a relatively short span of time, they vanish almost completely from historical memory. Their writings do not survive. Their doctrines are known only through critics. Even their name was physically erased from inscriptions in some locations. Erasure on that scale suggests more than simple decline. It suggests discomfort. The Ajavikas believed in strict determinism. According to surviving accounts, they taught that every event in the universe unfolded according to an unalterable cosmic order. No prayer could change it. No ritual could delay it. Everything that would happen had already been set in motion. Such a worldview sits uneasily with systems built on moral choice, divine intervention, or salvation through obedience. It also reframes catastrophe. In a deterministic universe, destruction is not punishment. It is process. That distinction matters when we turn to ancient texts like the Mahabharata, often treated as myth or allegory. The epic contains passages describing weapons of unimaginable power-blinding light, intense heat, widespread sickness, landscapes rendered barren. Most scholars interpret these descriptions symbolically or poetically, shaped by cultural imagination rather than historical memory. But even symbolic language reflects something. It reflects fear, expectation, and conceptual boundaries. The Mahabharata does not imagine small disasters. It imagines endings. Events so overwhelming that survival depends not on heroism, but on distance and shelter. Some argue that these descriptions are exaggerated metaphors for conventional warfare. Others note that they resemble, with eerie specificity, the effects of radiation and thermal blast observed in the modern era. No physical evidence supports the existence of such weapons in antiquity. No radioactivity, no blast craters, no mass graves bearing the signature of nuclear exposure. Yet the presence or absence of weapons is not the only question. Another question lingers beneath it. Why did ancient storytellers imagine destruction on that scale at all? Civilizations that have never experienced global collapse tend to imagine gradual decline, not sudden annihilation. They fear invasion, famine, disease. But total, blinding, irreversible destruction is a different category of thought. It suggests either extreme imagination or inherited memory. If ancient people believed such events were possible, even inevitable, then the logic of preparing for them becomes easier to understand. And if that preparation involved technologies or techniques deemed dangerous, heretical, or destabilizing to later belief systems, then their disappearance begins to look less accidental. There is also the problem of redundancy. The Barabar caves are not alone. A related site at Nagarjuni Hill, carved in similar style, shows the same polish, the same precision, the same strange absence of predecessors. Even more curious, these sites are geographically separated, as if designed not as a single refuge, but as part of a distributed system. Primary and secondary locations, backup shelters. Redundancy is not a religious requirement. It is an engineering instinct. Some historians resist this line of thinking, cautioning against projecting modern concepts, like systems or failsafes, onto ancient societies. They argue that we underestimate how much can be achieved through labor alone, and how easily extraordinary results can arise under concentrated imperial support. That is true, to a point. But it does not explain why such results were never pursued again, even when later empires possessed greater resources, better tools, and more time. Technologies vanish for reasons. Sometimes because they are inefficient, sometimes because they are replaced, and sometimes because they challenge the stories societies tell about themselves. If the caves represent a moment when humans believed survival depended on withdrawing from the world and sealing themselves away from forces beyond control, then that belief may have been incompatible with later religious and political frameworks, built on moral agency and divine order. In that sense, the disappearance of the technique may reflect a shift, not in capability, but in worldview. What remains is stone. Smooth, cold, reflective stone. Chambers that still perform their function perfectly, even though no one remembers precisely what that function was meant to be. The caves do not announce catastrophe. They do not warn or threaten. They simply exist, quietly, as if waiting for a moment that history decided never to record. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. That knowledge did not vanish because it failed, but because it succeeded too well and what it prepared for never came, or came in past, leaving only silence behind. Across the high ridges and remote hills of Scotland, there are ruins that resist the language usually used to describe decay. These walls were not simply broken, toppled, or weathered by time. They were transformed. Stone fused into glass. Rock slumped and flowed as if it had briefly forgotten it was solid. At first glance, the effect looks volcanic. Blackened surfaces, glossy streaks running between stones, sections where individual blocks appear welded together into a single mass. Early observers assumed these sites must be the remnants of ancient lava flows or igneous formations, misidentified as human structures. But excavations told a different story. Beneath the vitrified layers lay deliberate architecture, dry stone ramparts, carefully positioned on defensible ridges, unmistakably built by human hands. These are the vitrified forts. More than 200 of them are scattered across Europe, with at least 70 concentrated in Scotland alone. Most date to the Iron Age, roughly 2,500 years ago. They were hill forts, designed for defense, visibility, and control of territory. And yet, something happened to them, something intense enough to partially liquefy stone. Vitrification requires sustained temperatures of around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hotter than most natural wildfires. Hotter than bonfires fueled by wood alone, especially in exposed hilltop environments, where wind strips heat away rapidly. Achieving such temperatures over entire walls would require extraordinary effort, careful control, and an immense amount of fuel. This immediately raises a question. Why? Some researchers proposed that the vitrification was accidental, the result of enemy attacks using fire. But ordinary sieges rarely involve enough heat, applied long enough, to melt stone. Others suggested ritual destruction, burning fortifications after victory to symbolically end their use. That explanation, however, struggles to account for the technical consistency seen across multiple sites. By the early 20th century, theories had multiplied. Some speculated about exotic weapons, chemical fire, ancient flamethrowers, even focused sunlight using mirrored devices reminiscent of Archimedes' legendary death rays. Fringe writers went further, imagining prehistoric superweapons or echoes of forgotten advanced civilizations. Modern archaeology pushed back. In the 1930s, an experiment was conducted by archaeologist V. Gordon, child and engineer Wallace Thornycroft. They built a small-scale wall with a timber framework and a core of crushed stone, then piled several tons of wood against it and set it alight. After hours of intense burning, the wall collapsed, but parts of the stone core had indeed The experiment proved something important. Iron Age people could melt stone if they tried hard enough. But it also revealed something else. It took enormous deliberate effort, vast quantities of fuel, sustained heat, careful construction. This was not something that happened by accident or during a chaotic battle. It was intentional. Later studies complicated the picture further. In some cases, vitrification may have strengthened walls, as melted fine particles fused into a glassy matrix that bound larger stones together. In others, it weakened structures, causing collapse. This inconsistency deepened the mystery. If vitrification was a defensive technique, it was unreliable. If it was destructive, it was wasteful. Which brings us back to intent. One possibility is that these forts were never meant to be permanent, that they were built with the understanding that, at some point, they would be destroyed, sealed by fire, rendered unusable, transformed into something else. In this reading, vitrification becomes a final act, not of desperation, but of closure. There are hints of this in the archaeological record. Some vitrified forts show signs of deliberate burning after abandonment. Others appear to have been destroyed following conflict, perhaps as a display of dominance by conquering groups. Turning stone to glass is not just effective, it is theatrical. A statement that says, this place will never be used again. Yet mythology complicates matters. Celtic traditions speak of gods wielding flaming weapons, of spears that burn without consuming fuel, of battles that reshape the land itself. These stories are often dismissed as metaphor, but they preserve a cultural memory of fire as something more than a tool, fire as a force that ends eras. Some researchers wonder whether vitrified forts represent a meeting point between myth and engineering, not evidence of superweapons, but of a worldview in which fire held transformative, almost cosmic significance. A force capable of cleansing, sealing, or permanently altering a place. Still, there is an unease that lingers. If vitrification required such extraordinary effort, why invest it in places already destined to fall into ruin? Why not dismantle the walls, reuse the stone, move on? The choice to melt them suggests a desire to erase function, not reclaim resources. And here, the theme of containment returns. Stone that has melted and fused is harder to dismantle, harder to repurpose. It resists reuse. In a sense, vitrification locks a structure into its final state, preserving it as a scar, rather than a resource. The fort becomes a monument to an ending. No traces of radiation have ever been found at these sites. No evidence of nuclear blasts. Whatever caused the vitrification did not come from the sky in the modern sense. It came from human hands, wielding fire with intention. But intention toward what? Perhaps these forts were not simply defending against enemies, but responding to beliefs about cycles of destruction. Perhaps burning a stronghold was a way of ensuring that certain places, certain powers, would not rise again. Or perhaps the act itself was a warning and imprint left in stone to say that something here went too far. In that reading, vitrified forts are not failures of engineering. They are messages. Messages written in melted rock, telling future generations that at some point, people believed fire was the only way to end what they had built. And once stone has flowed like liquid, the boundary between construction and catastrophe becomes impossible to ignore. There is a moment, when standing among the remains of a vitrified fort, when the question subtly shifts. It stops being how the stone melted, and becomes why anyone would choose to do this at all. Because once the mechanics are accepted, once it is understood that Iron Age builders could, with enough effort, turn rock to glass, the real mystery begins. Most ancient architecture is built with reuse in mind. Stones are quarried, shaped, dismantled, and reshaped again. Cities cannibalize their own ruins. Temples become churches. Fortresses become villages. Materials move forward through time, carrying traces of their past lives. Vitrified forts break this pattern completely. Melted stone cannot be easily reused. Once fused, it resists clean separation. It becomes brittle in some places, impossibly dense in others. What was once a stack of manageable blocks turns into a single, stubborn mass. In practical terms, vitrification is a way of permanently ending a structure's usefulness, which makes it an odd choice, lest that was the point. Some archaeologists argue that vitrification was an unintended byproduct of destruction after conquest. A defeated fort burned so thoroughly that its walls partially melted. A dramatic end, but not a planned one. Yet this explanation struggles with scale and repetition. The same phenomenon appears again and again, across regions and generations, often in patterns that suggest coordination rather than chaos. Others propose that vitrification was an experiment in engineering a way to strengthen walls by fusing smaller stones into a glassy binder. In a few cases, this may have worked. But the inconsistency is hard to ignore. Many vitrified walls collapsed entirely, undermining their own defensive purpose. If this was a technique, it was a risky one, applied far more widely than its reliability would justify. This leads to a more unsettling interpretation, that vitrification was not about defense at all, but about closure. In several sites, signs point to deliberate destruction after abandonment. Forts burned not in the heat of battle, but after their strategic value had ended. Timber frameworks set alight. Fires sustained long enough to alter the stone itself. This was not a hurried act. It required preparation, fuel, and time. Why go to such lengths to destroy something you no longer need? One answer lies in ritual. Many ancient cultures marked transitions through fire. Fields were burned to renew soil. Objects were destroyed to release their symbolic power. In this context, melting a fort could represent the formal ending of its roller-controlled collapse rather than a slow decay. But ritual alone does not fully explain the choice of vitrification over simpler methods. Burning a wooden structure is symbolic. Melting stone is something else. It transforms the material at a fundamental level. It leaves a scar that cannot be easily erased. That scar may have been the point. Some researchers suggest vitrified forts were meant to serve as warnings, visible, permanent reminders of conflict, power, or transgression. A fort turned to glass tells a story that rubble does not. It says something extreme happened here. Something that demanded an extreme response. In myth, fire often marks the end of an age. Cities fall in flames. Worlds reset through heat. The idea that fire cleanses, seals, or concludes is deeply ingrained across cultures. Vitrification, in this light, becomes architecture aligned with mythic thinking. Not just the destruction of a building, but the deliberate sealing of a chapter in human affairs. There is also the possibility that these acts were driven by fear not of enemies, but of what the fort represented. Power centralized in stone. Strategic locations that could be reclaimed. Knowledge embedded in place. By melting the walls, later builders ensured that something could not easily return. This echoes a pattern seen elsewhere. Dangerous knowledge erased. Sites abandoned and sealed. Names chiseled out of inscriptions. Technologies allowed to disappear rather than persist. The destruction is not random. It is selective. If vitrified forts were destroyed to prevent reuse, then they belong to a broader category of ancient behavior, the intentional disabling of infrastructure deemed too potent, too tempting, or too destabilizing to leave intact. That interpretation reframes these sites entirely. They are no longer failed defenses or technological curiosities. They are endpoints. Places where someone decided that continuation was worse than annihilation. And once that idea takes hold, the melted stone feels less like an accident of history and more like a deliberate full stop. The fort is not meant to be rebuilt. The site is not meant to be reoccupied. The past is not meant to resume from here. In that sense, vitrified forts are not ruins in the usual way. They are conclusions, written in heat and time. Evidence that ancient builders sometimes believed the safest future was one in which certain places, and what they represented, were permanently closed off, which raises an uncomfortable question as we move forward. If some ancient structures were destroyed not because they failed, but because they worked too well, then destruction itself may have been part of the original design, not to protect the present, but to prevent the wrong kind of future. Deep in the forests of northern Bohemia, far from borders, trade routes, or population centers, stands a structure that feels fundamentally misaligned with its own era. From a distance, Hoska Castle resembles a medieval fortress, its stone walls rising from a sandstone outcrop, as if placed there by intention rather than necessity. But the closer one looks, the more its purpose begins to unravel. Medieval castles are practical things. They are built near water sources. They guard roads, rivers, or borders. They oversee villages that supply them with food, labor, and taxes. Hoska does none of this. It was constructed in the late 13th century, during the reign of King Ottokar II, in a place that offered no strategic advantage by conventional standards. There was no nearby settlement to defend, no enemy frontier to monitor, no economic incentive to justify its expense. More strangely, the castle was never fully inhabited. For years after its construction, the upper floors had no stairs leading down to the courtyard. Windows were built that opened not to landscapes, but to solid stone walls. Defensive features faced inward rather than outward, as if the architects were less concerned with keeping invaders out than with keeping something in. This inversion is not subtle. It is systematic. There is no well within the castle walls, only a system to collect rainwater. In a siege, this would have been disastrous. There are no kitchens designed for long-term occupation. No evidence of a resident garrison. Hoska looks like a castle, but behaves like something else entirely. At the center of it all lies a vertical shaft, a pit so deep that early accounts claimed it swallowed sound, light, and time. Local legends speak of it as a bottomless abyss. Objects dropped into it were said never to land. Stones vanished into darkness without echo. According to chronicles written centuries later, this pit existed long before the stone castle. A wooden fort once stood on the site in the 9th century, but it was abandoned. Travelers reported strange phenomena, spirits, creatures, disturbances that made the place uninhabitable. The land itself was considered hostile. These stories, like all folklore, are easy to dismiss. Medieval people explained the unknown through myth. But what complicates the narrative is the architectural response. Instead of avoiding the site, someone returned and invested enormous resources to build directly over the pit, not beside it, not near it. On top of it, a chapel was constructed above the opening, positioned precisely where the abyss was said to yawn. In Christian architecture, placement is rarely arbitrary. Churches are oriented east. Altars mark sacred ground. To build a chapel as a literal plug suggests containment, not worship alone. The chapel was dedicated to the Archangel Michael, the celestial warrior who casts Satan from heaven. His presence in art and iconography is almost always associated with boundaries between heaven and hell, order and chaos, salvation and destruction. If a medieval builder wanted to symbolically seal something dangerous, Michael is the figure one would choose. Inside the chapel, frescoes depict familiar scenes. Michael slaying the dragon, triumph over evil. But one image stands apart, troubling art historians to this day. A female centaur aiming a bow, using her left hand. In medieval symbolism, left-handedness was associated with deceit, inversion, and the demonic. Pagan imagery has no obvious place in a Christian sanctuary, especially one dedicated to a militant angel, unless it was meant as a warning. Some interpret the centaur as a relic of older beliefs, absorbed but not erased. Others see it as a coded message, a visual reminder that something beneath the chapel did not belong to the Christian order being imposed above it. Legends surrounding the pit grew darker over time. One story tells of a condemned prisoner offered a pardon if he agreed to be lowered into the abyss and report what he saw. He was pulled back up within moments, screaming incoherently. His hair turned white, his face aged beyond recognition. He died days later. Such stories follow familiar patterns. They dramatize fear. They transform unknown depths into moral lessons. But again, the response matters more than the tale. The pit was not filled in. It was not ignored. It was sealed, capped, and guarded by stone and symbol. Centuries later, the castle attracted new attention. During the Second World War, it was seized by the Nazis, who repurposed it as a storage site under the codename Bergen II. Official records describe mundane use as warehousing, looted books, and manuscripts. But unofficial stories tell of strange lights, experiments, and rituals. After the war, visitors noticed changes. A concrete slab where the pit was once said to be open. A sense that something had been disturbed, then closed again. No evidence confirms these claims. No documents prove occult experiments took place. And yet, Hoska's reputation persisted, outlasting regimes and ideologies. Locals continued to whisper. Guides continued to lower their voices near the chapel floor. What makes Hoska different from ordinary haunted castles is not the stories themselves, but the architectural logic that supports them. If the legends were invented after the fact, they align uncannily well with the building's design. A fortress with no external enemy. A chapel built as a lid. Defenses oriented inward. This is not how one accidentally builds a castle. Some historians suggest Hoska was intended as a symbolic monument, a show of dominance over a feared place. By building stone and faith atop perceived chaos, medieval authorities could demonstrate control over the unknown. The castle becomes a statement. Whatever lurked here is now contained. That interpretation is reasonable, but it does not explain why the structure was never integrated into normal feudal life. Why no community grew around it. Why it remained isolated, watchful, unused. A more unsettling possibility remains. That the builders did not believe the danger was gone, only restrained. If so, Hoska is not a defensive structure in the traditional sense. It is a containment facility. A place designed not to protect life from attack, but to separate the world from something believed to be fundamentally incompatible with it. In that context, the inward-facing defenses make sense. The lack of amenities becomes logical. The castle was not meant to be lived in. It was meant to be maintained, observed, left alone. As centuries passed and belief systems changed, the original reason for Hoska's existence may have faded, but the stone remained. The chapel stayed sealed, and the castle continued to sit, quietly, as if fulfilling a function no one fully remembered. If earlier sections showed humanity preparing to survive catastrophe, Hoska introduces a darker variation on the same instinct. Not preparation to endure the end of the world, but preparation to keep something from entering it. If Hoska Castle was built to face inward, then its chapel was designed to do something even more precise. It was not merely a place of prayer. It was an interface of boundary, constructed from stone, image, and belief. Positioned exactly where something was thought to cross from one realm into another. In medieval Europe, architecture was theology made solid. Walls did not only hold roofs, they held meaning. Orientation mattered. Symbol placement mattered. And nowhere was this more carefully considered than in sacred spaces, built over places believed to be dangerous. When fear could not be eliminated, it was structured. The chapel at Hoska sits directly above the sealed shaft like a stone lid pressed down by faith. Its dedication to Archangel Michael was not arbitrary. Michael is not a healer or a messenger. He is a threshold figure. The one who casts down, who guards gates, who enforces cosmic borders. In medieval iconography, he appears wherever something must be kept from crossing over. That symbolism transforms the chapel from a religious ornament into a mechanism of containment. Inside, the imagery reinforces this function. Michael stands in dominance, weapon raised, dragon subdued beneath his feet. Order triumphs over chaos. Heaven asserts itself over the abyss. But the unsettling detail, the female centaur, disrupts that message. Her presence does not belong to Christian narrative continuity. She is pagan, hybrid, liminal. Neither fully human nor beast. Neither divine nor damned. Hybrids, in medieval thought, were warnings. They represented the breakdown of categories, the violation of natural order. To place such a figure inside a chapel dedicated to a cosmic enforcer suggests that the builders were acknowledging something they could not fully purifyingly restrain. The centaur does not attack Michael. She does not flee. She simply exists, bow drawn, frozen in a posture that implies vigilance rather than defeat. Some art historians argue she may symbolize temptation or heresy. Others see her as a visual echo of older myths absorbed into Christian space without being erased. But within the context of Hoska, her presence feels less theological and more operational. As if the chapel was not designed to deny what lay beneath, but to mark it, to label it as contained but not destroyed. Containment architecture often follows this pattern. It does not pretend the threat is gone. It acknowledges it, then builds layers around it. Physical barriers reinforced by symbolic ones. Stone combined with belief. Structure combined with story. This dual-layer approach appears repeatedly across cultures. Dangerous places are sealed with markers. Sacred texts are placed at thresholds. Guardians, angels, demons, beasts are depicted not to invite worship, but to signal boundaries. Here is the line. Do not cross. The chapel floor at Hoska is sometimes referred to as the plug, a term that seems oddly technical for folklore. It implies pressure, force beneath, restraint above. Something pushing upward, something holding it down. Whether or not the pit ever truly inspired terror, the builders acted as if it did. They did not collapse the shaft. They did not fill it completely. They sealed it in a way that could be monitored, maintained, reopened if necessary. A filled hole disappears. A sealed one remains a known quantity. That distinction matters. In later centuries, the site's reputation attracted attention from those interested in hidden knowledge. During the Second World War, when the castle was repurposed, stories began circulating again, whispers of experiments, occult research, forbidden texts. Officially, nothing unusual occurred. Unofficially, the idea that something ancient and dangerous lay beneath the chapel resurfaced with new language. After the war, the shaft was reportedly covered with a concrete slab. For some, this was modernization. For others, it was reinforcement. Another layer added. Another seal placed. What is striking is not the persistence of legends, but the persistence of the response. Each era, when confronted with a site, chose not to dismantle it, not to excavate it fully, not to expose whatever lay beneath. Instead, they sealed it again. That pattern mirrors the behavior seen in other places we've explored. Knowledge erased rather than debated. Structures destroyed rather than reused. Spaces sealed rather than explained. The architecture of containment is conservative by nature. It assumes that curiosity is dangerous, that some questions are better left unanswered, that opening certain doors carries risks greater than ignorance. In Hoska's case, the containment is as much psychological as physical. Visitors report an unease that is difficult to articulate. The chapel feels heavy. Sound dampens strangely. The air seems still, as if circulation itself hesitates near the sealed floor. Skeptics attribute this to suggestion, to atmosphere, to the power of story. And they may be right. Humans are susceptible to expectation. We feel what we are told to feel. But architecture shapes expectation. And Hoska was designed, deliberately, to suggest restraint, to make people pause, to encourage distance rather than engagement, which leads to a quiet realization. Whether or not anything ever emerged from the pit is almost irrelevant. What matters is that multiple generations believed something could. And belief, when it persists long enough, reshapes stone. Hoska Castle does not scream warning. It whispers discipline. It does not invite investigation. It enforces hesitation. It stands as a reminder that sometimes the most important structures are not built to reveal truth, but to keep it sealed away. As we move deeper into underground cities and hidden chambers, the pattern becomes clearer. Ancient builders were not only preparing to survive catastrophe. In some cases, they were preparing to contain it. Beneath the quiet landscape of Cappadocia, where soft volcanic stone weathers easily, and villages appear unremarkable from the surface, there exists a contradiction so vast that it went unnoticed for centuries. Homes, fields, and courtyards rested above empty space, shaped not by erosion, but by intention. When that space was finally revealed, it was not a cave or a shelter, but a city. The place now known as the Daring Q Underground City descends 18 levels into the earth. At its deepest point, it reaches nearly 300 feet below ground, the height of a modern skyscraper inverted. It was large enough to house as many as 20,000 people, along with their animals, food supplies, and daily activities. And it was not meant to be temporary. The discovery itself feels almost accidental, as if the city had done its job too well. In the early 1960s, A local resident renovating his basement knocked through a wall and expected storage space. Instead, he found a corridor, then another, then a stairway descending into darkness so deep that flashlight beams vanished before reaching the bottom. What lay beneath the village was not an extension of a single home, but an entire hidden world. Derinku was carved by hand into tuff, a soft volcanic rock that hardens when exposed to air. The choice of material made excavation possible without metal machinery, but the scale remains astonishing. Stables appear on upper levels, likely placed there to keep animals closer to ventilation shafts. Kitchens, wine presses, storage rooms, schools, and chapels descend layer by layer. The deeper one goes, the more the architecture shifts from domestic to communal. Massive, circular stone doors, some weighing more than 1,000 pounds, were designed to roll into place from the inside, sealing off corridors completely. Each door had a single hole at its center, just large enough to thrust a spear through. Invasion was not merely discouraged, it was engineered to fail. Yet Derinku feels designed for more than war. The ventilation system alone suggests long-term planning. A central shaft, nearly 200 feet deep, distributed fresh air to every level, while also functioning as a well. Crucially, it could be sealed from the surface, preventing contamination. Side shafts branched off to ensure airflow, even if part of the system was compromised. Redundancy appears again and again, not just in doors and passages, but in the city's very breathing. There are over 50 concealed entrances, scattered across the landscape above. Disguised as ordinary pits, wells, or courtyards, each could be closed independently. Each level could isolate itself from the rest. This is not the architecture of panic. It is the architecture of anticipation. The evidence suggests people did not flee underground suddenly. They lived there deliberately. Wine presses indicate agricultural processing. Storage rooms imply planning across seasons. Classrooms and chapels suggest education and ritual continued below ground. This was not a place to hide until danger passed in a few days. It was a place to endure while the surface remained hostile. Official timelines attribute the main construction to the Phrygians, around the 8th century BCE, with later expansions by Byzantine Christians seeking refuge from persecution. That explanation fits part of the story. Cappadocia's underground complexes were indeed used as hideouts during periods of invasion and religious conflict. But Derinku stretches beyond those explanations. The scale is excessive for sporadic raids. The engineering goes beyond what short-term concealment requires, and the city's design seems optimized not only against human enemies, but against environmental collapse. Ventilation, food storage, waste management, and psychological sustainability all appear to have been considered. This opens the door to older possibilities. Some scholars suggest the first chambers may date back to the Hittite period, around the 15th century BCE. Others look further still, toward climatic events that reshaped human settlement across vast regions. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth entered a sudden cooling period, known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures in parts of Europe dropped dramatically. Ecosystems collapsed. Human populations were forced to adapt quickly or perish. If such a shift occurred over the span of decades rather than centuries, the surface world could become unpredictable, even lethal. In that context, an underground refuge stable in temperature, protected from storms, fire, and extreme cold, begins to look less like paranoia and more like resilience. Ancient texts echoed this idea. In the Zoroastrian tradition, preserved in the Avesta, a story describes the god Ahura Mazda instructing Yima to build a sealed multi-level underground enclosure to protect humans, animals, and plants from a devastating winter sent to cleanse the world. The description is strikingly specific. Controlled entrances, preserved life, a world beneath the world. Most historians treat this as myth, a symbolic flood narrative, inverted into ice. But myths often preserve shapes of memory, even when details blur. The resemblance to Derinku's structure is difficult to ignore. Adding to the unease is the broader context. Derinku is not alone. More than 200 underground cities exist across Cappadocia. Some remain only partially explored. In 2015, construction workers uncovered another massive complex beneath a hilltop fortress, possibly larger than Derinku itself. In some areas, tunnels appear to connect cities miles apart, suggesting a network rather than isolated refuges. Networks imply coordination. Coordination implies shared expectations. What, then, were they expecting? Invasions can be repelled. Winters pass. Empires fall and rise. But Derinku feels built for something that could not be confronted directly. Something that required withdrawal rather than resistance. something that might last not days or weeks, but generations. Critics point out the lack of direct evidence tying the city to global catastrophe. No definitive dates link it to Younger Dryas events. No inscriptions describe an impending end. And yet, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with cultures that may have intentionally avoided recording certain knowledge. What remains undeniable is the intention embedded in stone. Derinque was designed to disappear, to remove its inhabitants from the surface without leaving a trace of movement. From above, life would seem to vanish. That may have been the point. A city that survives by becoming invisible. A civilization that endures by retreating into the earth. If earlier structures prepared for disaster through containment or sealing, Derinque represents the most complete expression of that instinct. Not to protect a place, but to preserve a people. And as we move from hidden cities to vanished projects, the question sharpens. If such preparation was undertaken once, on such a scale, then what convinced its builders that the surface world could no longer be trusted? In eastern China, about 3 hours from Shanghai, there is farmland that looks ordinary in every measurable way. Crops grow. Villages function. Generations lived and worked the soil without suspecting that beneath their feet lay one of the largest subterranean construction projects ever attempted by human hands. Not buried by time. Not eroded by nature. Simply hidden. The discovery came in 1992, when local farmers decided to drain a series of village ponds, believed to be bottomless. When the water receded, it did not reveal mud or stone, but a staircase perfectly cut, descending into darkness. Then another staircase appeared, and another. What followed was not a cave system shaped by geology, but a deliberate descent into something vast and engineered. The site would become known as the Longyu Caves, though the name does little to capture the scale of what lies below. 24 enormous underground chambers were uncovered, each carved entirely by hand. Some are the size of aircraft hangars. Others stretch upward, nearly 100 feet, the height of a 10-story building. Concealed beneath fields no larger than a few city blocks, the volume of rock removed is almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates suggest more than 35 million cubic feet of stone were excavated enough to fill hundreds of Olympic swimming pools. And yet, no debris has ever been found. No spoil heaps, no tailings, no trace of where the stone went. This absence alone would be remarkable. But Longyu offers more. Every surface inside the cave's walls, ceilings, pillars, even the undersides of staircases is covered in the same precise pattern. Parallel chisel marks, angled and spaced with uncanny consistency. The grooves do not waver. They do not overlap randomly. They do not show trial and error. They suggest execution by a method, not improvisation. What is most disturbing is the uniformity across chambers that do not physically connect. Separate spaces, carved independently, displayed the same angles, the same spacing, the same disciplined restraint. It is as if a single design language governed the entire project, enforced with absolute precision. Archaeologists tentatively date the caves to around 2,000 years ago, during or shortly after the Western Han Dynasty. This was an era capable of monumental construction. The Great Wall was underway. Massive tombs were being built. Large-scale labor projects were not unknown. But even within that context, Longyu stands apart. There are no historical records describing its construction. No imperial edicts. No tax logs. No poems. No local legends passed down through generations. Chinese historical tradition is famously meticulous. Eclipses were recorded, comets noted, grain yields counted, omens interpreted. And yet, a project that would have required thousands of workers over many years leaves no textual footprint at all. Silence of this magnitude is not accidental. Some scholars suggest the caves were military in nature. Hidden barracks or wartime warehouses, designed to store supplies or shelter troops during periods of instability. The argument has merit. The chambers are dry. They include drainage systems. Some floors slope gently toward carved basins, as if designed to manage water accumulation. The caves sit beneath elevated terrain, offering strategic concealment. Yet this explanation raises its own questions. Why carve spaces so large that they echo emptily even today? Why decorate every surface with precise chisel marks if functionality alone was the goal? Why leave no trace of occupation, no soot, no refuse, no wear patterns from prolonged use? Others propose that Longyu was a royal underground palace, a symbolic counterpart to surface architecture. But palaces advertise power. They do not hide it. They leave records. They inspire imitation. Longyu did none of these things. Then there is the most provocative interpretation, that the caves were not built for everyday use at all. but as a protective measure against a perceived future threat. A subterranean refuge, not for short-term concealment, but for endurance. This idea gained attention in 2014 when a Dutch engineer proposed that the chisel marks themselves may encode information. He suggested the angles correspond to astronomical coordinates, perhaps preserving memories of celestial events, comets, impacts, cycles of destruction. The caves, in this reading, become not just shelters, but archives carved in stone. Mainstream archaeology remains unconvinced. There is no consensus linking the markings to star charts. No direct evidence of astronomical intent. But once again, the absence of proof does not dissolve the question. It sharpens it. If Longyu was meant as a refuge, it differs fundamentally from Darinkyu. There are no doors, no ventilation shafts of comparable complexity, no signs of long-term habitation. It feels unfinished, yet complete, as if prepared, but never activated. That impression is reinforced by the lack of lighting evidence. The deepest chambers are pitch black. Yet there are no soot stains, no torch marks, no residues that would suggest prolonged illumination. How were these spaces carved with such precision and darkness? What methods were used to see, to measure, to align? No tools have ever been recovered from the site. No chisels, no hammers, no scaffolding remnants. And yet, every pillar stands exactly where its counterpart stands in adjacent chambers, as if guided by a master plan visible only to its builders. The scale of coordination implied here is staggering. This was not the work of a small cult or isolated community. It would have required centralized authority, logistical planning, and sustained secrecy. Thousands of workers carving in silence, leaving no record, no trace, no memory. Why erase a project of this magnitude? One possibility is that it failed, that its purpose became irrelevant before it was ever used. If it was built in anticipation of catastrophe that never arrived, then abandoning it and erasing knowledge of it might have seemed easier than explaining its existence. Another possibility is more unsettling, that it succeeded too well, that the caves were sealed, their entrances submerged or hidden, their purpose fulfilled in a moment history chose not to remember. Longyu sits at the extreme end of a pattern we have seen repeatedly. Knowledge appearing fully formed, then disappearing. Structures built with obsessive precision, then abandoned without explanation. Preparation without recorded panic. Engineering without narrative. Whether bunker, palace, or warning, the caves refuse to resolve into a single meaning. They remain empty, silent, and unnervingly intact. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Longyu is not how it was built, but how it was forgotten. Because forgetting on this scale is not passive. It is active. It requires decision. And when an entire civilization chooses not to remember something extraordinary, the reason is rarely trivial. When these places are viewed one by one, it is tempting to treat them as curiosities, odd solutions to local problems, products of unique cultures, responding to unique pressures. A polished cave here, a melted fortress there, a castle built in the wrong place, a city hidden underground, caverns erased from memory. Each can be explained, partially, on its own. But when placed side by side, a different pattern begins to emerge. Across continents and millennia, human societies invested immense effort into spaces that reject the surface world. They carved downward instead of upward. They sealed rather than displayed. They built redundancy where symbolism would have sufficed, and permanence where temporary shelter would have worked. These were not improvisations. They were commitments. What unites them is not technology, religion, or culture, but a shared assumption that the world above could become unlivable, and that survival would require separation rather than confrontation. In every case, the builders seemed less interested in stopping disaster than in enduring it. Not winning, but waiting. Not preserving power, but preserving continuity. These structures do not celebrate dominance. They anticipate absence. Some believe this reflects ancient memory knowledge inherited from catastrophes too old to be recorded, preserved instead in myth, ritual, and architecture. Others argue it reflects imagination rather than experience, humanity's tendency to fear endings even in times of stability. And it is true that no single site proves that an ancient apocalypse ever occurred. But proof may be the wrong standard. Preparation does not require certainty. It requires conviction. And conviction is visible here, not in words, but in stone. What is perhaps most striking is how often this knowledge seems to have been sealed away. Techniques abandoned. Sites destroyed or forgotten. Names erased. As if later generations chose a different story, one that favored progress, permanence, and control over acceptance of cycles and collapse. In choosing that story, Something may have been lost. Not the knowledge of how to build, but the knowledge of when to hide. As the modern world invests again in bunkers, underground shelters, and contingency plans for climate, war, and cosmic threats, these ancient spaces feel less alien than they once did. They feel familiar, uncomfortably so. Perhaps the question is not whether ancient people knew something we do not. Perhaps it is whether they accepted something we have tried to forget. That the end is not always preventable. That survival is not always visible. And that sometimes, the most enduring civilizations are the ones that knew when to disappear.